Hello, and welcome to this briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. I am Esti Ari, Press Director at the club. Our guest today is Senior Fellow at the Jewish People's Policy Institute and an expert on U.S. politics and affairs, Shmuel Rosner. Thank you, Shmuel, so much for joining us and for making time.
My pleasure.
I know it's a busy day for you, and I know you didn't sleep much last night, which is one reason why initially we thought we were going to have this briefing tomorrow on Thursday. The other reason, of course, was the polls were calling this too tight to call. And there was some question about whether we would have a clear winner today. So once again, we see the questionable reliability of the polls. This is not the first time we've seen that. So just before we get to our main focus this afternoon, which is, of course, U.S.-Israel relations in light of the election, just if you have any thoughts on how the polls were calling it too close to call, and here we are in what seems to be a landslide victory.
Well, it was too close to call before the voters made their voices heard, and now it's not too close to call. I don't think the polls were way off. The margin in Wisconsin is less than 1%. In Pennsylvania, it's about 2%. In Georgia, it's about 3%. So all pretty much within the margin of error. People who expect the polls to be exact to the to tell us the exact number of people who are going to come and vote in every state and every county that's an over expectation. The polls should be close. They cannot be completely accurate. I think they did a decent job this time. It is close election, although more electors are going to Donald Trump because he was able to win in almost all states by a small margin.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to actually shift to our main focus for this afternoon, which is what this Trump victory and the return of Donald Trump to the White House will mean for U.S.-Israel relations, for the Middle East at large. And so one of the questions I guess I want to start with is, there's been a lot of discussion about the people who are surrounding Donald Trump. We know, of course, in the previous term, Jared Kushner played a large role, particularly in the Abraham Accords and other places. Today, we're seeing different people surrounding the incoming president. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about how that may impact his policies and approach both to the U.S.-Israel relationship and what's going on here generally.
Well, first, clearly, we need to recognize the fact that Trump 2024 is not the Trump of 2016 in a couple of ways. First of all, he's the leader of the party much more than he was 8 years ago. 8 years ago, we were still able to talk about the Republican Party, in which there are factions who have disagreements on certain issues. Now it is definitely Donald Trump's party. The Republican Party is all behind its leader. The leader was able to reemerge as the leader of the United States. So this is Trump's party. There is no internal friction within the Republican parties. That's one issue, which impacts the second issue, namely the type of people that will surround Donald Trump in his second administration. It's going to be a different team led by different people, not just different in name. It's not just the personalities. These will be people more in line with the Trump ideology. He's not going to get people from different factions of the party to balance one another. He's going to get like-minded people to support him and his policies. So we should expect a more coherently ideological type of a White House than in 2016. The last point to make here, we don't yet know what's going to happen in the House of Representatives, but Trump is going to control the White House, the Senate. There is a majority of Republican governors in the United States, possibly also the House of Representatives. So the power of the president, and if you include the Supreme Court, the conservative Supreme Court, the power of the president in 2024 is going to be much more significant than in 2016. And obviously, this will enable the president to pursue his own policies, again, in a more coherent way. So Israelis or Americans who expect an exact repeat of 2016 will probably be disappointed. This will not be a repeat. This is a newly installed Donald Trump, and there are going to be differences between the previous term and this one.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there and some things to drill down a little bit deeper into, and so we're going to take it a little bit slower to get into some of those issues. The last time you and I spoke about this, you had mentioned that you look at kind of Harris as more like a bond. You kind of know what you're going to get. You know, Trump is more like a stock. Could be great, could crash. You don't really know what's going to happen. Do you still see things like that in terms of the victory now?
I'll say two things about the differences between the two candidates. You know, but Kamala Harris is no longer relevant as a candidate, but to draw the parallels and the differences between the two is still useful. And I will mention two things: the difference between short-term and long-term considerations, and the differences between more predictable and less predictable policies. So the second topic is the one that you just mentioned. Kamala Harris is a traditional type candidate. She would probably, had she been elected, she would probably pursue a policy that is pretty much the traditional policy of the United States. There are, of course, variations. The policies of George W. Bush and Barack Obama weren't the same policies, or a Mitt Romney and a Barack Obama would not pursue the same policies, but they would still remain within this framework of traditional foreign policy. With Trump, we don't know. Trump is not a traditional candidate. He will not be a traditional president. So it's quite likely that he is going to go beyond these traditions and these, truisms of American foreign policy. So there are things that we might not expect and would still be forthcoming when Donald Trump becomes president. The second thing that I mentioned is the short term versus the long term. Israel is now at war, and that's something that most Israelis remember and have as first priority on their minds. With Trump, what we have with the war is probably policies that can benefit Israel, in the sense that he will, in some ways, untie Israel's hands. He is not going to listen to whatever international humanitarian organizations or the opinion of the European Union on what's going on in the Middle East. He's going to make his own policies, and Trump can be aggressive and can be willing. He might be willing to let Israel unleash its full power on the enemies. That's the short term. Then there's the long term. In the long term, we see Trump as a more isolationist type candidate and possibly president, when Kamala Harris was more of an internationalist in the Biden formula. So again, if we look at this from an Israeli perspective, the short term versus the long term and the predictable versus the unpredictable, these are the things that we must take into account. And I think both of them matter.
Okay, I think, again, once again, a lot to unpack. But I think, when you talk about within the framework, within the different things, when looking at Donald Trump not necessarily working within that same framework, well, the last time around, that willingness to be, let's say, not within the framework, to think creatively, perhaps outside of that, brought us things like the Abraham Accords. And so, a lot of people are wondering. For a second, I'm going to put the short-term war to the side just for a second, and talk about that, long-term. And I think it's, of course, all connected, right? Do you think that this is something that we can look forward to, again, kind of an expansion of the Abraham Accords, particularly on the Saudi track? How much is this going to be something that a Trump White House is going to put efforts into and care, particularly now that Kushner is not part of that inner circle in the White House? Is that something they're going to be pushing or not? Is it on the agenda? And in terms of looking at the region and U.S. Israel relations, how much that can be pushed forward? And of course, it's all connected to what's going on here. You mentioned Trump may unleash Israel in terms of its ability to act and offensively in the current war. So I guess I'm looking first in terms of both the Abraham Accords, does that indicate a kind of creativity of willing to look beyond? Or is this, that was a one-shot deal and we can expect a similar thing?
Well, first of all, I must say that I don't think enough people around the world are giving Donald Trump due credit for what he did with the Abraham Accords. This was a significant achievement for this region, and it came after many years in which many American presidents were trying to achieve peace in more traditional ways and failed. So he does deserve a lot of credit for what he did in the last term. Then again, we mentioned the fact that Trump is not the same Trump. It's also important to mention that the Middle East is not the same Middle East. Between 2016 and 2024, things happened here, and Trump cannot continue as if nothing happened between the end of his previous term and the beginning of this term. Iran made some moves during the years in which he wasn't in office. The situation on the ground here changed. Hopefully, there is still chance to expand the Abraham Accords and move forward with the peace process or normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But this all have to follow some type of exit strategy from the war. We are still at war on at least two fronts in Gaza and in Lebanon. And until we see a way forward on these two fronts and possibly something with which to calm down the Iranian front, I don't think there's much that can be done on the Saudi front. So Trump will have to deal first with the urgent matter, which is the war, and only then he can pursue these grand ideas of expanding the Abraham Accords and pursuing more normalization type processes.
Let's talk about that for a second, about ending the war. Trump has said, he said, the war's going to end and we're going to do it quickly. What does that mean? What does that mean? Does that mean we now have, does that mean that there's going to be put pressure on some kind to bring the war to a halt? Or is it perhaps, like you say, unleashing Israel to be more offensive and win the war in the sense of bringing it to an end? Some kind of agreements that we're looking at, favorable or unfavorable to Israel. What do you kind of see going on in terms of Trump's desire to bring an end to the war and on all the fronts and all the various fronts, including, does this open up another perhaps opportunity for bringing the hostages home now that there's different actors in play here?
Right. Well, so putting it simplistically, there are two ways to end the war. One is to put pressure on Israel to stop. The other one is to put pressure on Israel's enemies to stop. In both cases, one depends on the ability of both or the tendency of the two sides to agree. If one side decides to keep fighting, then there will be no end to the war. So the question is whether Trump is going to put pressure on Israel or on Israel's enemies. And my hope, I can say that this is what he's going to do for sure, but my hope is that both Trump and President Biden will take advantage of the narrow window of time that we have between now and January 20th to say the following thing. If you want to end this before Trump is coming in, now is the time to go back to the negotiating table, because otherwise, who knows what's going to happen? This can work against Israel's enemies. Hezbollah and Hamas might think to themselves that, it's better for them to get some type of compromise under the Biden administration rather than wait for Trump, because who knows what Trump might do. Israel will have the same calculation. It wants to end the war as quickly as possible, and if its enemies will be willing to come to terms with some kind of compromise that Israel can accept, maybe it's better for all parties to end this now and not wait for Trump to get into the arena and make some unpredictable moves that could harm either Israel or its enemies or both. Ideally, you would think that the outgoing and the incoming American presidents would cooperate to achieve such result. I'm not sure that in our case, these two gentlemen are able to work together in cooperation to achieve such thing. But basically, the wiser foreign policy for the United States is to come to all parties and say, look, there's a short window of time. Biden is unhinged. There's no reason for him to consider a successor from his own party. He can do basically whatever he wants as a lame duck. Trump is not yet president, so he can wait patiently and just be, this menacing presence of someone who is about to come but not yet in the arena. This could be the time frame in which all parties agree to end the war and compromise and possibly get the hostages back to Israel, which is something we all hope and pray for.
Yeah, so you mentioned a lot of Israel's enemies and some of the opportunities are not there. And I want to focus specifically on Iran, which obviously we know that during the first Trump administration, he pulled out of the JCPOA. We know that Iran has been threatening Israel with yet another attack directly onto Israel's territory from Iran. We know that it is continuously attacking Israel from its proxies all over the place. And some said it would be around now, around the election, before the election, after the election. So on the one hand, we have this window of opportunity, as you describe, perhaps to bring the war to some kind of close. On the other hand, perhaps it's a very dangerous time. I've heard a lot of people discussing that this time period now, these 2.5 months or so, right, that we have until January 20th, where it's unclear, is anyone going to take any action? Is this an opportunity to do, for any side, to kind of like take the opportunity where Trump's not in yet, Biden is a lame duck, as you say, not quite clear how strong the White House is going to want to react on any kind of action here.
Yeah, you're right, but it's dangerous for the Iranians as well. They as they sit around the table and think about their next move, they need to take into account the fact that the response of the United States to any move that they might make now could be anything. Biden no longer has to consider the consequences for his successor. He can respond. He can do whatever he likes to do in response to an Iranian attack or to Iranian or to any other provocations from Iran. And there's also, I think that Trump as a candidate kept saying that with him in the Oval Office, all of this wouldn't have happened. Now, of course, people say, how would you know? You can't know. It's not a preposterous idea to think that Trump has this presence that is in itself a type of deterrence against some enemies because of him being, because people look at him and say, we don't know what he's able to do because he's unpredictable, because he's quick to anger. They don't want to get on his bad side. So for the Iranians, it is also, they'll also have to consider the new situation. And when they decide whether to attack Israel, they should remember that there's a new situation in Washington, which might mean one of two things: either that Israel can now respond more forcefully to any attack without worrying much about the United States, trying to stop it, or even for the United States under Trump to become more aggressive and work against Iranian interests in the region. These are all things that are up in the air. We can't say for sure what's going to happen, but clearly what happened tonight in the United States is going to change many of the parameters that determine the way all countries in the region and all players in the region make their decisions.
Certainly, I think that's that must be true. You know, everyone is going to be looking at what happened in the United States and looking at their calculus in terms of how they want to act and not act, the risks that they're willing to take in terms of all of their actions now. Here also we saw, you know, there's been a shakeup internally here in the makeup of the cabinet. Do you think that that will have any impact on the working relationship between Israel and the United States, both on defense and in general? And of course, then it's relationship, of course.
Look, I don't think it will have a huge impact on the long-term relations. With the Biden administration, it makes things somewhat more awkward. Clearly, the Biden administration doesn't see this change favorably, but I think this will mostly impact Israeli society and politics. And as Israeli society and the political arena react to the moves by the prime minister, this could impact the relations between Israel and the United States. But this will not be a direct impact. I don't think Donald Trump is much interested in the identity of Israel's defense minister. He is going to work with whatever defense minister that Israel is going to have. If Israel become restless or chaotic or has to go into a new round of election, or if there are things that will happen in Israel and will make Israel's situation politically, domestically, socially more complicated, this could impact the way the United States looks at Israel, at its situation, and on its ability to win the war.
So from there, I want to go actually to, you know, you said Donald Trump is going to work with whatever defense minister. I imagine Donald Trump is going to work with the prime minister. And that's the Netanyahu-Trump relationship, which has had its ups and downs. Mainly up, I would assume, occasionally down. And I'm wondering if you see any shifts, first of all, in the past few months in that relationship. We saw both the prime minister and the president here in Israel immediately issue congratulatory notes to incoming President Trump shortly after he spoke this morning. What kind of a relationship do you see between the two men?
I think that Netanyahu is going to do the utmost effort to be on Trump's good side. I don't think he wants to get into a fight with President Trump. It worked fine for him to get into some kind of tension or even a fight with President Obama and with President Biden, because these are presidents that the Israeli public often thought weren't pursuing policies that are the policies favored by most Israelis. But for Netanyahu to get into a dispute with President Trump could be problematic, both politically, domestically, because the Israelis value the relations with Donald Trump, and also, you know, if you can get along with a Republican friendly administration, this means that you can't get along with anyone, and that becomes a problem for you and not for the other side.
So I want to take the last few minutes that we have today to actually talk a little bit about that aspect, the Israeli public versus perhaps the American Jewish public. We talk a lot about the polls before. We talked about, you know, kind of how people are voting. Polls here in Israel showed that most American Israeli voters and also Israeli Jews here would support President Trump in an election versus we saw in the United States, the American Jewish vote, not necessarily. And I'm wondering, what does that tell us about the different perceptions? Obviously, people are not voting on the same issues all the time, but also in terms of the perceptions and what's important or what's key to people here. I wonder if you can talk about maybe that differentiation. Also, in terms of what does this mean for the Israeli Jewish relationship with the American Jewish relationship?
Right. Well, one would expect that having been through this exercise more than once, both Israelis and Jewish Americans would understand by now that that's the way it goes. when American Jews vote for someone, Israeli Jews want the other guy. It's almost always a guy. This time it was not a guy, it was a gal. But Israelis preferred Bush over John Kerry. Jewish Americans voted for Kerry. It was the same with Obama and McCain, Obama and Romney, Trump and Clinton, Trump and Biden, and now Trump and Kamala Harris. Israelis vote mostly on Israel's security. That's their reason to support a certain candidate for the presidency. They understand that the American president has other issues on its mind other than Israel's security, that there is the economy and abortion and immigration and all these important things that Americans vote on. But when Israelis think about the American president, they only see him as the guardian of Israel. And if they see someone that they consider as the more aggressive, the more instinctively in line with their tendencies, they'll support him. American Jews have other considerations. Of course, most of them do support Israel, but that's not the only factor that impacts their vote. For some of them it is, but for many of them it isn't. They prioritize other issues, and it's not as if they had to contend with two candidates, one of which is a friend of Israel and the other one is an enemy of Israel. Both candidates claim that they will be friendly towards Israel in their respective ways, but Jewish Americans could just say, okay, Israel, check. Both Harris and Trump is going to be okay with Israel in their own separate ways, and we can vote on other things. Most Jews in America voted on other things. A majority of them voted for Kamala Harris. How large this majority is isn't exactly clear. We have two exit polls with different outcomes. One of them says it's 65-35. One of them says it's 79-21. So these are quite different. At least for now, we don't know for sure the share of Jewish Americans who voted for Harris versus Trump, but we do know that it's between 2/3 and 4/5. It is the clear majority of American Jews. Israeli Jews will have to, accept that, and American Jews will have to accept the fact that Israeli Jews are quite happy with the outcome in the United States, even when the American Jewish community is more apprehensive about it.
Well, I guess we'll see what happens in the coming days and in the coming weeks and the months and years ahead. Like you say, it's some things are a little bit still unclear and unpredictable. Perhaps that's the way he likes it. Like we say, keep folks on their toes. But it's certainly going to be an interesting few weeks ahead, and certainly until the inauguration. And we'll see how the Trump administration also takes shape in terms of who is going to be surrounding the incoming president and what that means for policy. So I want to thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I know it's a crazy day. We look forward to continuing these conversations in the future.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you also Jonathan Beck and Ali Naor, my colleagues from the JPC, for facilitating this briefing. Have a good evening.